From the Delhi studios of Republic TV, it's time for Arnab Goswami on the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the Ukraine top brass talking about a World War III having begun, to Russia entering nuclear facilities, to the West that is getting Ukraine to fight its battle, who is really provoking this war? Let's debate.
Hours after the second round of talks between Russia and Ukraine ended, there were attacks around the nuclear power plant. There were global concerns regarding this attack, though Russians claimed that they had extinguished the fire and the reactors were undamaged. But the whole area around this nuclear power plant has been taken into control by the Russians.
Російські війська атакували Запорізьку атомну станцію, найбільшу в Європі. Вона одна могла бути як 6 Чорнобилів. Російські танкісти знали, що вони обстрілюють. Прямою наводкою по станції – це терор небаченого рівня.
We condemn the attacks on civilians, and over the night we have also seen reports about the attack against the nuclear power plant. This just demonstrates the recklessness of this war and the importance of ending it, and the importance of Russia withdrawing all its troops and engage in good faith in diplomatic efforts.
Let me also quickly give our viewers the update that we got earlier in the day in terms of the areas that have been covered so far. What are the kind of Russian troops that have been brought in? Remember, you have various specialized units of the Russian troops that have entered the Ukrainian territory, be it the East Military District, or for that matter, the 14 Corps of the Russian army. They've all come in. And look at the number of battalion tactical groups that have been brought in by the Russian troops. In some areas, roughly about 14 to 15 BTGs have been at work.
Overnight, a projectile hit a building within the plant site, within the site of the plant. This building, I should repeat, is not part of the reactor, is none of the reactors, is a training adjacent construction facility to the reactors.
Russia has the option of using nuclear threat all the time. If they don't continue intervening, probably they will manage to avoid the Third World War. But the Third World War has already started.
Что Третья мировая может быть только ядерной. Но обращаю ваше внимание, что это в голове западных политиков постоянно вертится ядерная война, а не в голове россиян. Поэтому я вас уверяю, что мы не позволим каким-то провокациям заставить нас выйти из равновесия, но если против нас начнут развязывать реальную войну.
Despite the claims that NATO would not provide a no-fly zone over Ukraine, there are some that hint that the position has changed.
With more death, more suffering, and more destruction. As the Russian armed forces bring in heavier weaponry and continue their attacks across the country.
Amidst it all, when the need of the hour is de-escalation, there are some making irresponsible statements and calling for the assassination of Putin. Since the war broke out 9 days back, there is devastation and thousands of lives have been lost. And the need of the hour is de-escalation and not a war-mongering rhetoric, because war always comes with a price.
This evening from Washington, I have Daryl Kimball. He's Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. Professor Michael Beckley is Professor of Political Science at Tufts and a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Zachary Paikin is from the Center for European Policy Studies, is joining us from Toronto. We have with us Nikolai Isanu. He's former advisor to the Prime Minister Ion Chicu and former Deputy Minister of Justice for Moldova. And we have with us Hanna Lyubakova, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. From Tiruvananthapuram in India, we have Professor Madhav Nalapat, well-known strategic analyst and vice chairman of the Manipal Advanced Research Group, editor of the Grey Zone. From Washington, I have Max Blumenthal, who is joining us this evening. And finally, Syed Muhammad Ali Tagavi, associate professor of political science at the Alame Tabatabai University in Tehran. So this is a very important discussion because we are connecting Washington, Bern, New York, Toronto, Moldova, Poland, India, Washington, D.C. again, and Tehran. And we'll try and get the widest representation in the course of this discussion. Max, I want to start with you. It's been too long and everything has been on the edge for far too long. And every morning raises the possibility of a new flashpoint, taking things to a zone where we are not in a position to predict what will happen next anymore. Like this morning, what was seen to be the attack in the nuclear reactor, which was then found out to be a reactor somewhere within the complex, and there were fears of radiation. You fear that if the situation continues to be on the edge for too long, it could just spiral out of control, and no analyst will be able to predict what will happen next. Max.
As many in Washington would like to see. And that's one of the dangers here. This war needs de-escalation. It needs to come to an end through negotiation. And what we've seen here is the second PSYOP deployed in this war, the first with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky claiming that Russia aimed to attack the Chernobyl nuclear plant. And now we have U.S. media and U.S. officials howling that Russia somehow attempted to create a nuclear disaster by targeting a nuclear plant, when in fact Ukrainian troops were operating in and around this nuclear plant, firing RPGs at Russian positions. They were neutralized and Russia is taking control of the plant. So if Russia wanted to blow up this nuclear plant, it would have done so by air. It would, if it's in control of it, it could detonate it right now and then cause a massive disaster and kill, I don't know, millions of Russian-speaking people who support Russia inside Ukraine, which comprises 1/3 of the population. It doesn't make sense. And it suggests to me that rather than de-escalation, there are elements in Washington that want to escalate this war by creating more and more friction. It reminds me of what the U.S. did and NATO did in Syria around Duma in April 2018 through two inspectors from the international agency, the OPCW, Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, according to inspectors, a false flag attack by proxies in order to create the image of a chemical attack by the Syrian government, which triggered U.S. and British airstrikes on Syria. So there's talk of a no-fly zone from the Ukrainian president, from extremist elements here in Washington in the Senate, and that would lead to a third incident.
Those rash decisions. So we have to be
very careful and look at the facts on the ground.
Absolutely, Max. But who has the greatest influence over Ukraine? And there are two possibilities, if I may go across to Michael Beckley, please, who is at Tufts. Professor Beckley, this war can end on either side, Ukraine or Russia. Now, Russia is not going to stop its military advance, and hence there will have to be a negotiation. The question is, in the process of continuing to encourage the people of Ukraine to fight without any direct military involvement, and by sending more and more military equipment via America and its allies to Ukraine, isn't the West really provoking this to carry on further, dragging it for longer, and increasing the possibility of a flashpoint? Professor Beckley, please.
I think it's a little strange to point the finger at the West, considering Russia is the country that sent more than 100,000 troops into another sovereign nation. Russia is the country that is using overwhelming firepower, not just against military targets, but against civilian targets. And we want to talk about facts. I mean, these are facts that we see with our own eyes on video footage that's widely available around the world. And the idea that the West is the one, that the Ukrainians somehow would not have fought against an invasion of their country by a hostile power without the West's support strikes me as completely absurd. I mean, the West, there are lots of voices in the West that are also very concerned about escalation. The West was looking for diplomatic solutions, whether it's President Macron from France going to Putin, Biden making overtures. Plenty of countries have said, look, we want a diplomatic solution to this problem. And the West is also responding with economic tools rather than pouring NATO forces into Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia has been escalating not just the size of its invasion, but also the firepower that it's bringing on. And now there's reports of thermobaric weapons, which are these vastly devastating weapons that wipe out civilians all around them, being used indiscriminately on civilians. So I find it very strange that the conversation has started by targeting the West as if that is the entity that is provoking this horrible conflict, when Russia is clearly the one that invaded Ukraine.
No, you see, that is, I mean, you're absolutely, Professor, you are entirely entitled to your view in your perspective of this, and you've been critical of how I have put things, but that is from your perspective. The way I look at it more practically, and I'd like to go across to Professor Ali Tagavi from Tehran, Professor Syed Mohammad Ali Tagavi. I was just saying that if it is a question of exercising influence over Ukraine, America has influence over Ukraine. And hence, maybe America and the West can play a role in de-escalating this quickly. That's all that I was suggesting. I don't think it's a criminal proposition to put through, because if Americans tell me tonight that no, we have no influence over Ukraine, it's their own battle, their own war, their own minds, their own philosophy, their own thinking, nobody's going to believe it. Professor Beckley, I will just end with one thing. Let us not forget that this entire war has begun with a sustained effort by America over the last 1 decade for greater strategic control over Ukraine. That is a fact, and that cannot be denied. So I'd like to hear from Tehran next. Professor Tagavi, please.
Ukraine wasn't allowed to be in NATO, so I don't understand how you can say that Ukraine has been enfolded into the West.
Well, if this was, I mean, I'll let Professor Tagavi respond, and then I'll come in later. Yes, please, Professor.
Hello to you and all the participants. Thank you for having me. Actually, we think, of course, the war has started with Russia. They invaded Ukraine. However, we know that there was a lot of provocation by this the attempt of Ukraine to join NATO. I think that was important, and it has created some provocation. But however, we know that the invader is Russia, nevertheless. So the West has a kind of implicit role, I think, in the conflict. They could have stopped it before by just not helping Ukraine.
Precisely. I mean, and that's, I'm going back to the point here that the West cannot say we have nothing, we have nowhere, we have no interest in what's going on. The entire world is watching, and I think the West must exercise some influence. What do you think? Daryl Kimball, weren't you concerned this morning when there were these reports about the alleged strike on the nuclear plant on Ukrainian soil? Doesn't that cause concern to you, the way it played out this morning?
Well, of course, it's of tremendous concern that the Russian forces, and it was the Russian forces who fired into the complex. That's what created the fire in the training facility next to one of the 6 nuclear power reactors. The fire was put out, but this just underscores the tremendous dangers of a war in a country with a large civilian nuclear weapons industry. Russia, by firing into this area, has violated its international commitments regarding the protection of civilian facilities. And let me just go back to a couple of things earlier in the discussion in this debate. It's our position, and has been our position at the Arms Control Association, that there were some misjudgments during the 90s about the issue of NATO expansion. And Russia may have some legitimate concerns about the overall European security architecture. But let's just be clear here. There's no justification. There's no threat from Ukraine towards Russia that justifies a massive invasion by 150,000 plus Russian forces. President Putin has very clearly bypassed the option for a diplomatic solution. He's causing tremendous civilian harm, firing on cities, threatening nuclear power plants. And I would add, and this is my specialty, he's put Russian nuclear forces on alert and introduced a dangerous additional element into this crisis. So I think it's quite clear here in Washington that the Biden administration is not seeking to escalate the situation. President Biden has been abundantly clear that U.S. military forces will not become engaged, or NATO forces, with Russia. That would be very dangerous. But it is clear that the United States, Europe, and the entire international community, 140 countries, made this clear, believe that Russia's action is illegal. And it is quite understandable that the international community is trying to provide humanitarian and defensive military support to the government in Kiev, a democratically elected government. So, that's how we see it here. I think I would agree with others that an immediate, unconditional ceasefire is necessary to avoid further bloodshed and humanitarian harm. Eventually, there needs to be a diplomatic settlement that brings Russian forces out of Ukraine. Where we go from there, it is very unclear. There is no serious international affairs analyst who can tell you exactly how this is going to play out. It's a dangerous situation. None of us know how exactly this is going to end, but the first step is to stop the fighting.
I'd like to get Professor Madhav Nalapat on this, and Mr. Kimball, just want one quick response to what you said. You have said that inevitably there will have to be a quick conversation. And I think out of all the panelists, even those in disagreement with each other on other points, everyone is of the agreement that a solution is necessary immediately. We all sat around the table, and this very channel 1 week back, we expected this to end, but the way it is playing out, it can play out for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks. And I don't think the world needs to suffer the stress of a flashpoint every 5 or 6 hours. And we don't know where this will start and where this will stop. I'm not talking about a US TV show host who's called for killing Putin. I'm not talking about Lindsey Graham, for example, a US senator who says that you got to kill Putin. call for the assassination of Putin. I'm not talking about things like that, but I'm talking about a situation where, Madhav, more troops are moved, NATO troops from the Romania border near Ukraine. You're deploying the NATO response force. America is constantly saying we are not going to get engaged, but who knows anything about a false flag operation? I mean, you can't read what the Russians will do. If things get worse, economically for the Russians can provoke a false flag operation and create a nuclear crisis. Do we want a nuclear crisis? At that point of time, everyone will anyway have to come, Madhav, around the negotiating table, whether we like it or not. So if it's an inevitability, Professor Nalapat, why not prepone the inevitability rather than delay it? If you're all going to sit around and talk a month from now, and the whole international community will be involved, it will be. Why not do it now? And who's going to bell the cat, Professor Nalapat?
Look, Arnab, our American friends are all saying, and they are friends, they are our partners in the Indo-Pacific, and that is why we are a little unhappy about the fact that they seem to have completely forgotten about the Indo-Pacific, except in a very, if I may say so, in a very indirect way, and their focus has once again gone on the Atlantic, as though this is the USSR. Well, that aside, they all are talking about peace. They all want peace. Now, their top leadership has been talking about destroying the Russian economy. Their top leadership has been talking about the Russian people coming on their side, and what is the unique method? By destroying their livelihoods and bringing them to a situation of destitution and poverty. That seems to be, according to them, the best way of bringing the Russian people on their side. Now, the point is that the war hysteria is being created in the West, in every country in the West. I don't blame our distinguished professors in the US for talking like this. Their students will probably pelt rotten eggs at them if they do anything other than abuse Russia. In India, fortunately, we are in a somewhat different position, and we are looking at it in absolute horror. How, on the one hand, are you talking of peace and negotiations? On the other hand, you are demonizing a country, you are ridiculing a leader. I mean, mad is one of the most charitable things that world leaders are saying about Putin. The world leaders, I'm not talking about television anchors, I'm not talking about academics like ourselves, I'm talking of high elected officials. Now, Arnab, if this is the way the US, the UK, the EU believe that they are promoting a good, healthy dialogue with Russia, I would like to tell them that from our perspective, it seems absolutely the wrong approach. What we are doing, Arnab, is stumbling towards a much bigger conflict. You know, you remember that the First World War, a lot of books have been written, how the world sleepwalked into war. The West is now stumbling and shambling.
Correct.
And really, in its confused way, it is basically leading the world to war, and we are also, the rest of the world, NATO, Russia, the West, they will be at war. The rest of the world will be collateral damage. We don't want to be collateral damage. We want good sense to prevail on our American and European partners.
That's absolutely true. Get a response here. Sergey, would you like to respond? Sergey from Bern. He's a professor of political science at Baylor University at Bern. Let me get a response from Sergey, please. Sergey, please.
Yes, I think we have to remember that what Ukraine is doing is it's fighting for its independence. And it's relying on significant military support from Western countries, not to escalate the conflict, but in order to preserve its independence, to defend its lands that are being attacked by the Russian troops. They're being attacked on totally fabricated pretext because, as other commentators already said, Ukraine is a much weaker country. It's a much smaller country. There is no comparison in terms of the military expenditures between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine presents no threat whatsoever to Russia. Ukraine will never become member of NATO in any foreseeable future because many countries within NATO are strongly opposed to this membership. And Russia knows that very well. So Putin created a totally fabricated pretext He claims that there are some Nazis in power in Ukraine. He claims that Ukrainians want Russians to come in, but your own television channel in front of you showing signs or images from Ukraine of Ukrainians standing and peacefully protesting against Russian troops. They are showing courage through the non-violent protest, just like Gandhi was leading the Indians against the British oppressors after World War II. In the similar manner, Ukrainians in non-violent manner are protesting against the occupiers in different towns of Ukraine. And they are showing that Putin's claims that Ukrainians are somehow willing to see Russia back on their territory are absolutely bogus. And they will never, ever tolerate Russian presence.
No, you know,
so even if Russia manages to conquer parts
Sergey,
of the Ukrainian territory, there will be a significant instability and insurgency that will continue on these territories. Whether or not the West will continue supplying weapons, that is not important. The conflict will continue until Russia occupies Ukrainian territory.
No, it is important. No, it is important. It is very important, Professor Kodelia, and I'll tell you why. And I'd like to go across to Zachary Pakin there, who is joining us from Toronto. And my point is that I think I have had at least 3 representatives tonight of the Western point of view, Daryl Kimball, Sergey, Professor Beckley, all telling me that the questions I'm raising are unimportant. But from our perspective and the world's perspective, they are very important. And my question is very simple. Let's not complicate it. If you are saying we are, and you said, I didn't say it, Professor Kodelia, you said it. You said, listen, Ukraine can forget dreaming about being a member of NATO. If I were to slightly exaggerate what you said, in our wildest dreams, the people of Ukraine must stop thinking about becoming a member of NATO. We are never going to let you into NATO. Then why don't you say it? Why hold out this threat? Say it. Let NATO say it. End the war. I'm telling you, NATO says it tomorrow. NATO says this tomorrow morning. Dr. Zachary Paikin, NATO says the reality tomorrow. NATO says it officially to the people of Ukraine and the world, and to Putin, and to India, and to China, and to every part of the world that, look here, let's not play pretend. We're never going to let the Ukrainians into NATO. Forget it. I can tell you within 1 hour the war is over. But you won't say it. You want to drag the war. Why? Because Wall Street is looking very chirpy. Because you're 6,000 miles away and you think the fallout is not going to hit you? Because your defense companies are very, very happy? Very, very happy. Their stocks are going up. They're making billions. War is good business. Raytheon CEO Craig Hayes has been gleefully saying, we would see. He says, Craig Hayes, Raytheon's chief executive officer, say, we're very happy because this is great opportunity for international sales. And if I say these things, I'll be told this is irrelevant. Please think about the suffering of the Ukrainian people. I think about the suffering of the Ukrainian people. I don't think the Americans think enough about the suffering of the Ukrainian people, truly. I don't think so. I think we in India care more about the suffering of the Ukrainian people than the Americans do. Yes, please. Dr. Zachary Paikin, please, from Toronto.
Well, I agree indeed that it was unfortunate that Western capitals were not willing to discuss the status of Ukraine at all, that they made that a red line during the negotiations that occurred over the course of the past several months. It would have been, useful simply because we would have lost nothing simply from offering a deal to test Vladimir Putin's intentions. About whether or not he was actually serious about negotiating or whether he was simply putting forward his demands so that they would be rejected and to justify a war. Of course, any offer that we made to him could have been withdrawn in the event that he decided to invade. We seem to have gotten a whole bunch of principles in the West mixed up, right? We tend to lump a whole bunch of different things together. There's Ukraine's right to be a liberal democracy. There's Ukraine's right to be a sovereign, independent state recognized within its internationally recognized borders. And then there's the question of its right or lack thereof to join a military alliance. And those are not all the same things. And we associate all those things with the so-called freedom of countries in Europe to choose their orientation. And it's that difference of perspective, unfortunately, between Russia and the West. On the one hand, the Western perspective that countries have the right to choose their orientation entirely. And that means values orientation, but also geopolitical orientation, et cetera. and the Russian perspective, which differs from that, which defines indivisible security in a fashion that
I don't know,
states.
but Dr. Zachary, can I intervene? Can I intervene? I have a very simple question. I get very detailed replies to very simple questions. My question is very simple, sir. Someone answer my question. North Macedonia in 2020 inducted into NATO. Ukraine, neither here nor there. Keep them hanging. Why? Because the longer you keep Ukraine hanging, the longer you keep Russia hanging. So keep them hanging. And let there be a world war if required. And if we come close to it, let's say the people of Ukrainians, like the charge of the Light Brigade, theirs is not to question why, theirs is to do and die. That's exactly the scenario we are seeing. Please tell me, Dr. Zachary, you seem to be a very reasonable academic. Please tell me, why not make it clear? Why keep the whole NATO issue hanging and then say it's irrelevant? Of course it's not irrelevant, it's most relevant. This is what the war is all about.
Obviously, people who have supported NATO expansion for the past several decades have an incentive to say that, oh, of course, this is not about NATO. It has nothing to do with NATO. It has to do with Vladimir Putin's hatred of Ukrainian statehood and, of liberal democracy in general. So you can, think about that, whatever you sort of want. I agree that, it would be useful for us to get off the fence. I think that simply promising Ukraine NATO membership for the past 14 years while not actually delivering it only results in a situation where you antagonize Russia, but with little actual gain. You got to get off the fence and basically pick a lane. And as for right now, I mean, in the middle of this hot war, I would disagree with those who have put forward the notion that the Biden administration is deliberately trying to escalate the situation. Although I don't believe that they've made enough of an effort to de-escalate the situation. Now, let's make no mistake here. This is Vladimir Putin's war. He started this war. He did not have to start this war. Countries in today's international order have an obligation to resolve their disputes peacefully, and this is an illegal war of aggression. But nonetheless, we all have, as many have highlighted as well on this panel, an interest in ensuring world peace and stability. And you have to, in order to do that, you need to have a degree of you have to basically provide off-ramps that provide Putin with some sort of an incentive to de-escalate. And if you escalate the sanctions to such a high level as they are right now, without providing any indication that you're going to withdraw them, and it's very difficult to withdraw them for political reasons. I mean, Putin and Russia in general right now are reviled in the West. So if he thinks that there's no chance that those sanctions will be lifted, he's only going to try to gain what he can, which is, to basically achieve his political and military.
No, it's not about. Okay, so it's not about. My issue here is, see, if the West wants to make Russia pay economically for its strategic ambitions, it's clear to all of us. Russia is getting ambitious. Put Russia in its place. It's a small economy. It's 1/10 the size of China. We can't economically fight China. Russia is getting ambitious. Crush Russia's economy. Put Russia's in its place. That is the West design. My question is, and I want to go to Nicolae Esanu, who is joining us from Chisinau. He's former Deputy Minister of Justice of Moldova. He's former advisor to the Prime Minister there. This whole situation, how do you see it? So you're so close to the situation there on the ground. Is it so difficult to de-escalate this? Nicolae Esanu, please.
Yes, it is rather difficult to de-escalate the situation, as the situation is created by President of Russia without any reasonable explanations. In fact, we had here in Moldova, and there was debates in Russia, in Ukraine, it is possible to have a war between Russia and Ukraine? And the answer was almost unanimous. Never. Russia and Ukraine are brothers. In fact, if you recall the history, the Russia appeared in the current Ukraine. In fact, the history of Russia starts with Kiev, Russia, and the Kiev is called the mother of Russian cities. So no one here in this part of the war can expect it rationally that the war will start. As it started unpredictably, so it's difficult to assess when it will stop. And sorry for saying this. Of course, the discussion about Western, Eastern fights, about future, NATO future of Ukraine, it can be debated. But now we have one question. We have a war. And we have to speak about stopping the war. Any other discussions are, in my opinion, immoral for the moment. And when you proposed that somebody to put pressure on Ukraine to stop the war, I hardly can see how this is possible. You have an aggressor and a victim. And for sure, the war can be stopped by aggressor. The victim cannot stop the war. Ukraine defend their independence. This will be a popular war. The authorities distributed from, I'm following very closely, you rightly said, we are neighbors of Ukraine. In fact, the situation in Moldova is peaceful. It's a problem of refugees. We received more than 100,000 of refugees from Ukraine, which for Moldova, it's a huge effort. As the population of Moldova, it's 2 million. Well, 2.5 million. We are looking very carefully at this. I suppose you know that in this part of the world we speak Russian. So I'm following very closely what's happened in Russia. And unfortunately, there are not signs how the war can be stopped. There are no logical arguments. So you speak about these sanctions against Russia, but the sanctions are due to the war. If Russia did not invade Ukraine, you will never succeed to have such a strong unanimity in European countries. These sanctions are discussed for a long, long time, but there was countries in Europe which did not agree. You know, the European Union are union of 28 countries. In order to adopt a decision, you need unanimous decision of 28 countries. And the Russian invasion in the Ukraine succeeded to a miracle. Nobody expected that this would be possible to achieve. And the sanctions are the only tools which are more or less realistic, which will force Russia to stop the war. I do not see other options for stopping this really heavy war.
Can I?
Yes.
Can I give a slightly different perspective to this, and maybe Max can take it further from there. My response to you, Nikolay, and Dr. Zachary, and Professor Beckley, and Sergey, and Daryl, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying here is, the war has gone on for much longer than any of us in this discussion had hoped, or wanted, or feared. And it is now getting, as Professor Nalapat said from India, into a very dangerous ground. Russia does not want to be on the losing side. And my concern, Max, is this, that a long war with severe economic sanctions crippling the Russian economy, while working well for the West in the short term, might push Russia to take what the West will then say are very irrational decisions. We need to be careful. And the Russian Foreign Ministry, said there is no guarantee that there will be, quote, no incidents with NATO. So anything can happen tomorrow. On the 2nd of March, Lavrov said if a third world war happens, it will involve nuclear weapons. I'm just telling you the sequence of events. If we don't want to see it, well and good. Yesterday, Belarus was strengthening its air defenses along the perimeter of its border in line. This morning in India, we heard about a gunfire battle within a nuclear power plant. And then some, American politicians saying, let's kill Putin. So it's getting into, we are already in a very irrational situation. That's all I'm saying. The longer it drags, the more likely it is going to go out of control, Max. That's all that I'm saying, and we'll all suffer.
And the worse the situation will be on the ground in Ukraine for Ukrainian civilians. I think we all want to see de-escalation. Everyone on this panel wants to see de-escalation. But when EU, NATO, US countries are calling for shipping in millions of dollars of Stinger missiles and aircraft and Javelin missiles from Poland, that is not de-escalation. When Hillary Clinton, the author of Libya's destruction, goes on US TV and calls for fueling an insurgency inside Ukraine like the kind we saw in Afghanistan and Syria, that is not a call for de-escalation. When Francis Macron openly calls for economic war on Russia, that is not a call for de-escalation. It is literally a call for war. When US media openly encourages mercenary psychopaths and social misfits to travel to Ukraine and participate as foreign fighters, that is not a call for de-escalation.
Exactly.
When the US rips up the intermediate nuclear forces treaty, that is not a call for de-escalation. When the US violates the agreement with Gorbachev and expands NATO closer and closer to Russia's frontiers and places dual-use missile launchers on Russia's frontiers, that is not de-escalation. When the US sends billions and billions of dollars of weapons into Ukraine and 1,000 US military trainers into Ukraine at Russia's doorstep to fuel a war in eastern Ukraine that has seen 14,000 people killed, mostly on the pro-Russian side in Donbass, that is not de-escalation. It is a war that has been going on since 2014. And I don't know why so many Western analysts have trouble with context and analysis, because this is the context that people in the West need to understand to avoid further escalation and end this war. Can we imagine in America if Russia and China placed missile launchers on the US-Mexico border on the Mexican side, along with Russian military trainers and proxy forces, and called for an insurgency inside the US? It would be unimaginable, and the US military would never tolerate it. So that's the wider context for understanding this really unfortunate and terrible war. But unfortunately, we can't get that context from our media in the US. All we hear is that Putin is a psychopath who wants to restore the Soviet Union. It's time for real analysis and real de-escalation to end this war.
Arnab, if I could jump in with a couple of perspectives here, please.
Yes, please, Daryl. Daryl responding to you. Yes, Daryl.
Yeah, let me just note that if Max, everything you just said were accurate, I might agree with you, but I have a difference of opinion with you about some of the historical points you've raised. Let me just point out that I've been working for 30 years in the nuclear arms control disarmament realm. I work every month with Russian security experts on these tough issues. I've been in touch in the last few days trying to forge a common approach to how to end this war and how to de-escalate. There are some legitimate issues of security that Russia has had before this conflict, and there are diplomatic pathways to deal with them. Some of the charges that President Putin made in his rather wild speech about justifying his invasion are just fabrications, such as Ukraine pursuing nuclear weapons. So there are diplomatic approaches to resolving the legitimate security challenges that exist in a post-Cold War European security architecture and on the nuclear arms control disarmament issues that we all want to pursue. But there is no justification. There's nothing that the United States did, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago that justifies this illegal invasion. And so I think it's just very unhelpful to suggest that Washington, and you're selectively picking out a few names of, yes, there are always irresponsible figures in India, in Europe, in Russia, in the United States, who we can cite selectively. But I think it's irresponsible to suggest that the greater West wants to inflame the situation. I think what we all need to do is we need to focus on the immediate priority, and I think we all agree that an immediate unconditional ceasefire is crucial, and that diplomacy. Arnab, you can't just dismiss that. I think that is a common agreement across the board here.
No, I'm not dismissing. I'm responding with something. Since you mentioned history, I want to give you a historical example. That's all.
Okay. And that the next step is for a diplomatic process to be pursued after the conflict ends and after Russian forces are withdrawn. How exactly that happens at this hour is not clear. It is uncertain. It may be unlikely, but that, I think, is the clear path forward that's been outlined by the vast majority of international experts, governments around the world. And it is unfortunate, and I must say, that India has, as a government, sat on the fence at the United Nations. A democracy has not stood up in support of another democracy in Ukraine. And here in the United States,
we're not sitting on the fence.
There's disappointment about that.
No, we're not sitting on the fence.
That action.
No, one second.
You tell me
I'll tell you one thing, sir. Daryl, I'll tell you one thing. Daryl, I'll tell you one thing. See, Daryl, first of all, with the greatest of respect, please understand, you're talking about India, the world's largest democracy. We are one of the world's largest economies and the world's largest armies. So I think, if you don't mind my saying this directly to you, I think this is a rather patronizing approach. Allow me to complete. I know you won't like to hear this. It's a rather patronizing approach where you assume that you have direct control over India's foreign policy. You don't. I said it yesterday on my program on numerous occasions. When it comes to India's national security, America has stood against India. Okay? You are not proving to be dependable. I can take a bet with you, Daryl. I can take a bet with you. I'm not questioning your personal intentions, that if China does to Taiwan what the Russians are doing to Ukraine, the Americans will not lift a finger at this point of time. I am, on the contrary, very, very practical. I'm saying that Russia is provoking. I'm saying the West cannot say they don't provoke. And before I bring in, yes, I will come to you, Professor Beckley. I'll just say one thing. You mentioned history. I'm saying don't let the matter boil and boil and boil and boil and boil. And please, I'm just saying don't add fuel to the fire by giving Stinger missiles, by giving weapons. By standing on the edge of the amphitheater, at some point, please, someone like you who's involved in arms control, please look at the bigger picture. You know, you don't realize this, Daryl. Maybe you don't understand my perspective, Professor Beckley, but I think you almost pushed the world into a massive confrontation when you killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and 9 by violating international law. Did you predict how they would respond? What did America do, what the CIA do in 1953? When they tried to destabilize the government of Iran, do you remember what you did then? You are playing by the same blueprint. You know, what did you do with Gaddafi? No, what did you do with Gaddafi? The point is, Caesar, the point is, allow me, allow me, now you don't want to hear me, you see, because I disagree with you and because I'm putting together a very solid argument to counter yours. I'm saying, sir, there's a threat hanging all over the world. And I'm not going to go into a blame game saying you did this in the past, that in the past. Of course, the Americans know what they did in the past, but I want to remind the Americans that when your president, whether you like him or not, flew down to Singapore to shake hands with Kim, who you've been caricaturing as the dictator of Korea, the American media first was curious and then it applauded. Said, wow, fantastic, look at the great generosity of our government. We're even talking to Kim. This is not Kim, this is Putin. It's a far greater threat. I'm just saying let's get practical. Over to Professor Beckley, and I think Professor Nalapat is dying to respond to that after that. Yes, Professor Beckley. Michael Beckley, please.
Well, I think we just need to separate two things. I think you can be critical of the United States, as many people, of U.S. foreign policy, as many people in the United States are. You can be against NATO expansion. A lot of people, including myself, think that it was a mistake, and you can understand Russia's grievances against that and why it might feel threatened. But I think you can also then condemn Russia's invasion, which seems vastly disproportionate to any kind of threat that it was possibly facing from Ukraine. I mean, is there some secret plot that Ukraine had to invade Russia or to dismember it? Was there some secret agreement to bring Ukraine into NATO that I'm not aware of? I don't think so. And so I just feel like we're artificially creating barriers among this panel by saying, oh, if you don't blame the West for this particular crisis, that you're writing off all of the other bad things that the United States or other Western powers have done. I think that both those things can be true. You can be critical of past steps. And just, one thing I can't let stand, that was what Max Abrams said, where he talked about giving Ukrainians Stinger missiles, et cetera. Why is the United States and other countries doing that? Could it be that Russia has invaded with tanks and aircraft and armored personnel carriers and weapons of massive harm? Max talks about, oh, it's not de-escalation when you sell arms to Ukraine. Well, what's also not de-escalation? Invading a country from 3 different sides with more than 100,000 troops. You know what else is not de-escalation? Putting your nuclear arsenal on high alert in the middle of the largest war in Europe. So you want to escalate the conflict? I mean,
you're openly saying you want to escalate the conflict.
I want to help civilians. I want to help civilians who are being. I want to help. Don't cut me up. I want to help civilians. I want to help civilians who are being massacred.
You want the civilians.
I want to help
civilians
who are being massacred
and die.
I want to help civilians who are being massacred by military forces. I want to help civilians who are being massacred
militias like the Azov battalion that controls Mariupol right now. What you are calling for is a Syria-style solution, which is no solution at all. It would be a disaster for Ukrainians and for the region. It would
what's your solution, Max? What's your solution to let the Russian military? Answer my question. What's your solution to let the Russian military just massacre Ukrainians? To let the Russian military overrun